Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. We're talking about, well, a right nobody this episode.
That nobody is John Wick.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk off the stories of film, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, development stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and love. Just that, the films that we know and, well, sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and an appreciation that it's really, really hard to get a film made. With all that preamble, I've got two corking films for you in this episode, though, so I'm just going to get on with the first of them. Bit of action just to get us started. I'll play you a clip from the trailer, and I'll bring back that nobody for you as well.
How much?
Excuse me?
How much for the car?
She's not for sale.
You have good day, sir.
Daisy.
I lost everything. That dog was a final gift from my dying wife.
Jonathan.
You got out once. You dip so much as a pinky back into this pond, you may find something reaching out to pull you back in.
It's personal.
Where'd you get that car?
What does it matter?
It's not what you did, son. It's who you did it to.
Nobody?
That nobody is John Wick.
And surprisingly, that actually is a clip from 2014's John Wick, directed by Chad Stahelski, written by Derek Kolstad, and starring Keanu Reeves, Michael Nyqvist, Alfie Allen, Adrian Palicki, Bridget Moynihan, Ian McShane, John Leguizamo, Dean Winters, and Willem Dafoe. And so let's go back to 2012, and a writer by the name of Derek Kolstad, who didn't have too much profile in Hollywood at that point, was doing promotional duties for one or two movies that he'd been writing. He'd done he'd been credited on a pair of Dolph Lundgren movies. I won't hear a word said against Dolph Lundgren. And so, as the Action Elite noted, he'd done One in the Chamber, and he was also working on a film called The Package as well. Kolstad had been keen to break into screenwriting to the point where he basically, when he was 24, decided to gamble, quit his job and make movies full-time for a living, or at least try to write them. And so he was writing spec scripts to try and drum up some trade. Spec scripts being scripts that nobody's paid for. You write them on spec and hope that someone will give you a large check for them if they happen to like them. And so he'd been generating quite a lot of these, and one that he started telling the Action Elite about in 2012 was called Scorn. And in his words, it was a film where the main character in my mind was a revolving door through which any number of actors fell into the role. And he was thinking an action movie headlined by people like Harrison Ford, Robert De Niro, Jean Reno, George Clooney, Burt Lancaster, Richard Burton, Clint Eastwood, Sidney Poitier, Denzel Washington, Lee Marvin. Those were the kind of names in his head as he was writing the script. And so he revealed in July 2012 that I just finished up Scorn, which is a lean and mean tale of revenge, similar in tone to Taken or Leon, The Professional, A Man on Fire from Tony Scott. And he said it's out to UTA, United Talent Agency, for final review and release. Now, this was a spec script, though, that Kolstad really got some bites on. And it was in late 2012 that the script had gone out to market, and it picked up fairly quickly a trio of offers. But unusually, Kolstad decided to go with the lowest of the offer, the company willing to put the lowest amount of money in, which was a firm called Thunder Road Pictures. Now, the reason he went with Thunder Road was it wanted to make the film quickly, and he kind of figured he could sit around and wait for the big money, or he could take what was on offer now, get the film made and get it out into the market. Now, I'm not quite sure in the chronology where the actor Eva Longoria came involved with this, but I do just want to note that she's listed as a producer on the film due to the fact that she put in some of the funding to help make the movie happen, that she wasn't an active producer, but she wrote a check, as the directors and writer acknowledged, that helped get this towards production. So at some point in the chronology, she was in there too. One thing more certain was that it was in April 2013, just months after the script had sold, that Keanu Reeves agreed to star in the film. And of course, once you've got Keanu Reeves on board, that tends to accelerate things. And so that had come through a friend of the ultimate producer of the movie, Basil Iwanak. And his friend was at United Talent Agency, someone called Charlie Ferrero, and he'd sent him the script. And so this is talked about in Edward Gross and Mark A. Altman's book, They Shouldn't Have Killed His Dog, the complete uncensored oral history of John Wick, Gung Fu, and the New Age of Action. And in that book, it's described by Basil Iwanek that the lead was a 75-year-old man, 25 years after being retired. And he explained that when he read the script, it was kind of the fun of watching Clint Eastwood kick ass that appealed to him. And he said, I thought, okay, there's probably one or two names you could do this with, Clint Eastwood, Harrison Ford. Other than that, I'm not sure how I put this movie together, but the tone of the script for John Wick was subversive and really fun. It has a very clear emotional through line and a great premise for an action movie. Now, of course, Keanu Reeves wasn't 75 at the point he took the film on. And in fact, at this stage, he was having a bump or two in his career, that he'd made his feature directorial debut on Man of Tai Chi, which hadn't done great guns. He'd been shooting the film 47 Ronin, which also didn't do great guns either. And I mean, the offers were still coming in, but this was by distance one of the more interesting. And so the central character in the film Scorn, I should acknowledge this, was a character by the name of, wouldn't you know it, John Wick. And this turned out, Kolstad revealed to Channel 3000 in the end, to be the name of his grandfather. It was his grandfather, very much live and kicking as well, who didn't, as it turned out, mind lending his name to a contract killer. And so Reeves read the script. He got hold of it through the agency as well and got in touch with Kolstad. They spent a bit of time together, and he was clearly interested in working on the movie, to the point where, as Reeves explained to Movies.com, I worked with the writer Derek Kolstad. He was amenable to me playing the role and working on it, and so it went through that pass. What that pass did was reduce the age of the central character to someone now edging towards 50, coincidentally. And so Reeves was happy to sign on the dotted line. And then it was the time to bring in another key member of the John Wick personnel. So Chad Stahelski had crossed with Keanu Reeves for the first time on the Matrix films. And by the time the third Matrix film was shooting, Chad Stahelski was the martial arts stunt coordinator on that particular project, and one of the people that he worked with to put the stunts together for the Matrix sequels was David Leitch, himself from a stunt background. And so Reeves had stayed in touch with the pair post their working together on the Matrix films. And meanwhile, Leitch and Stahelski had set up a company called 8711. And this is a company that was directing and advising on fight scenes in major movies. And so they did second unit work, for instance, on films such as The Wolverine, the first two Hunger Games movies. They were on one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles films as well. And they were rapidly building a reputation as go-to people for stunt work on Hollywood movies. And as Reeves explained to The Hollywood Reporter, I mean, he brought Stahelski in to work with him on John Wick, but he said, when I got John Wick, I sent it to them originally for the action part of the film, but, and the Hollywood Reporter emphasises, he leans in and whispers, secretly hoping that they'd want to direct it, and then they did. And Reeves explained that they had a great vision for the film, which I think they've realised very well. And so John Wick was going through the system as a relatively low-budget production. Its final budget was around $20 million, which is pennies compared to what the latest John Wick film is costing. And what this meant was there was an opportunity there for potential first-time filmmakers certainly first-time movie directors to come in and pitch for the work. And as David Leitch told IGN, he said, over a weekend, we just jammed through and made this incredible sort of lookbook visual presentation. And he said that we had a lot of video viz and choreography that we'd done in the past that we'd always wanted to apply to something, and it really applied to John Wick. So we really edited it and put sounds to it, and then we just brought in this visual presentation, and they put it in front of the producers and said, this is the movie we see when we read the page. What do you think? And the response to that was very, very strong, to the point that, yeah, they were in. Stahelski and Leach were the co-directors of John Wick. Now, they went into this with a view of making this particularly real, that I don't think I'm going out on a limb to say that Hollywood action movies weren't having the best of times in the early 2010s, that it had taken a film such as Gareth Edwards' The Raid, Indonesian action film made by a Welsh director, to really demonstrate what had been lacking from Hollywood. The Raid is an exceptional, I mean, it's almost not to call it an action film, it is a fighting film, but bringing an intensity of action that just hadn't been seen in big blockbusters. And Stahelski and Leach knew this going in. They knew that they wanted the fighting in John Wick to have a rawness and an edge that had just been lacking from so many American films. Now, part and parcel of that, of course, was the preparation. In fact, preparation was key for Keanu Reeves as well, as Leach told the film stage that Reeves went through 4 or 5 months of analysing the script, talking through it. John Wick's character, who is John Wick? And he explained that he was really taking control of that and guiding us in what he wanted to perform and what he thought John was, so we could execute it. It was collaboration. The rest of the cast was falling together because this was heading to production quickly as well. That the script had been sold at the end of 2012 and production was being earmarked for the autumn of 2013. And so people like Michael Nyqvist, brilliant in the film, and Bridget Moynihan came in. I mean, Moynihan, for one, said she didn't read the whole script ahead of filming, as she wanted a bit of distance from what her husband in the movie was really doing. But with an ensemble in place, filming could begin on September the 25th, 2013. And they were really keen to use the streets of New York as part and parcel of the production as well. The old buildings of New York, the bits of New York you don't tend to see. And they talked about, they wanted to shoot it in a way that where other directors would look up, they wanted to point the camera down. They were looking for action sequences with very long takes for some of the shots. And they were looking to do so much physicality in action. Now, that decision alone took a toll on its leading man, who was pushing 50 at that stage. I think Keanu Reeves, as a 50-year-old, is far more able to do things than most of the rest of us as 50-year-olds, but still, bodies age. And Reeves would admit that being older, there were moments when it was really tough. He says you want to be able to do everything, but there were certain times during filming, he explained to the Los Angeles Times, when you're in the 16th hour of the 3rd day of shooting a big action sequence when I just couldn't do something. And he admitted that was depressing. But he did have a way of just allowing his body to recover, because he started using cold plunge baths. Never used that phrase in this podcast before. The kind of a cold plunge bath, used it twice now, that tended to be used by high-level athletes, and that was installed in the guest bathroom at his accommodation. And he said, I first learned about ice on The Matrix, but this was another level. I get home from a day of filming, get the water to 37 degrees, I'm assuming he means Fahrenheit rather than centigrade, because that would be a whole other film, and lie in it up to my neck. He described that as heaven. And so, I mean, reflecting on the action, I mean, the action is clearly very key to the world of John Wick. And the Raid was, the intensity of the action in the Raid and the Raid 2 was clearly one of the touch points here. And in fact, Reeves would reflect on this in an interview with Movies.com. And he explained that the intensity of that action was all the directors. And they had a mild concern over the rating, but Reeves argued that even the Raid 2 didn't get an X or a restricted. And he said the directors had more of a tableau idea. They wanted less cuts and really seeing the action without close-ups, except for a few broken bones. They just had a different take on it. And he explained, I think how they wanted to do the violence was to have this hyper reality around it, but that you could still identify with it emotionally and understand what's happening and why, and keep it fun. Now, I've read a couple of set reports from journalists who were on set with John Wick, and they just talk about the actors just being made up as if they've had 7 shades just beaten out of them. And I think that's a fair reflection of what happens in the film as well. But also there was quite a lot of, I'm loath to say improvisation, but there was quite a lot of spontaneous work done during the shoot of the film when you consider how intensely choreographed you might imagine the action to be. And as David Lynch would explain, the way we trained Keanu was like he had a library of techniques, and when we found our locations, it was often last minute. And he explained, because we're choreographers, we were confident to just design something we thought would be compelling, and Keanu would step in and deliver. And he just said, I don't know if other directors can do that. This was a relatively new approach for Keanu Reeves, who no stranger to action films. But again, he explained to movies that I'm usually trained to choreography. And in this one, I was trained to be able to do choreography. And he added that he was told, here's a bunch of judo, here's a bunch of jiu-jitsu, here's a bunch of tactical and practical training with a pistol and a long gun, and here's how to drive a car, clucking, I think that says, radically. Okay, you know how to do all of those. Now on the day, we're just going to make, I think that says make bits up. And Stahelski explained the kind of approach they're going to IGN as well. He just said, we tried to take a bit of old school blocking that used to be very prevalent in film, that they were moving away from 5 camera and super shaky and handhelds and super tight lenses, in his words. And he said, we tried to let things live a little bit more. Even our blocking, our acting, our car chase stuff. And he just says it does take some of the kinetic energy away, but on the other hand, it lets you live in the shot a little bit more. And he described it as an elongated kind of composure. So Stahelski also added that, it was crucial that they did this on set, that when you see Keanu Reeves go through 5 guys, that's Keanu Reeves going through 5 guys. They mean 5 other people, not 5 guys, the burger chain, again, for the sake of clarity. It's Keanu Reeves doing the judo. It's Keanu Reeves doing the jiu-jitsu. And he explained, why does everyone like the character? Why does everyone like him? Because it's Keanu Reeves doing it. And why would we try and hide it? Now, of course, that didn't mean that there weren't things that they did have to hide. So one of the conditions of shooting on location in New York, even though they were blocking off streets and had all sorts of permits, was, for instance, when they were doing a car chase, the cars still had to abide by the speed limit, even though they had the whole street to themselves, that they weren't allowed to use blanks in the gun. So every muzzle flash that you see on screen on John Wick when they're on the streets in New York, that's been added in post-production as well. But on the whole, it was there. It was in camera. Also on set, it's worth noting, was Derek Kolstad, that he knew things would change from his script, but he was allowed and he was able to be close to the production, and he was happy to be a part of it. And filming, relatively swift shoot really, wrapped up on December the 5th, 2013. Just over 2 months it had taken to film the first John Wick movie, which, is worth noting, was by this stage known as John Wick. It was no longer called Scorn. And Derek Kolstad explained this in an interview with Digital Spy, that the catalyst for changing it was Keanu Reeves, because he was constantly referring to the project by the character's name rather than as Scorn. And so in the end, Lionsgate just followed the publicity, thought, if Reeves keeps saying John Wick, we're getting publicity out of that, let's just go with John Wick. And thus Derek Kolstad's grandfather wasn't just a character in the film, he'd given his name to the film as well. Now, the post-production period was marked to a degree by Directors Guild of America ruling, the DGA, even though both Stahelski and Leach were fine with it, they said in interviews, and they continue to work with the DGA. DGA rules only permit one person to get a directing credit on the film. Now, we had this in the last episode of Film Stories that I did, Sin City, where Robert Rodriguez, the director of that film, the co-director of that film, wasn't allowed to share director credit under DGA rules with Frank Miller and guest director Quentin Tarantino. What Rodriguez thus did was, after offering the credit to Frank Miller, which he turned down, is he quit the DGA so they could be listed as co-directors. But in the case of John Wick, well, Stahelski and Leach were still keen to be part of the Directors Guild of America. And so in the end, they knew they basically co-directed it. Stahelski would take the director credit. Leach was going to be listed as producer. And I think pretty much everybody in Hollywood who needed to know, well, they knew who really had been steering this particular ship. It had been a very testing and difficult shoot for John Wick. It is worth noting that the schedule was incredibly tight. There was a lot of filming that took place at night. The shooting was taking place in the winter as well, and so it was cold, it was dark, the days were long. What they were trying to get into camera was really complex as well. But the start of 2014, what it meant, I mean, they had so much in camera that they didn't actually need to do an awful lot effects-wise in post. And so they started editing the start of 2014, and a release date was being earmarked for October of the same year. And that really wasn't causing that much of a problem. Now, there was some stuff that was pulled out. I mean, the running time of John Wick is a relatively lean 101 minutes, which, given the way the franchise has expanded since, it's quite interesting that one of the key appeals of the first film is just how stripped down it is, just how much it takes out that you ordinarily might expect in a Hollywood action movie and what it chooses to focus on. But they didn't have any money left over to reshoot anything. They couldn't go back and do any other scenes. And so when it came to the edit, they did have to make some cuts with that in mind, that they couldn't do any of the pickup shots. But in the end, they arrived at the lean cut of the movie that we ultimately got. And very lean, actually. I mean, quite a lot of material was cut out. But when the film went before a test audience, when it wasn't being seen by filmmakers for the first time, well, the response was really, really strong. I mean, to the point where, I mean, you'd go back to producer Basil Iwanek. He knew from the early test screening that they had something here, and there was a growing confidence that John Wick might just be the film to give, I mean, Keanu Reeves a nice hit in the autumn of 2014 and also make a fair bit of money for Lionsgate as well. What's interesting, though, is really just how late Summit and Lionsgate came into this particular process, because the story goes that as late as the summer of 2014, nobody had picked up the distribution rights to the film. I find this completely incredible that Thunder Road had brought it into life, and the movie was finished and went out to potential distributors, but only one offer came in, and that was through the aforementioned Summit, of course, owned at this stage. The deal had been completed by Lionsgate. And so, it's reported in Screen Daily on the 11th of August 2014, so that's a month and a half before the film was ultimately released. It didn't even have a distributor. This had been entirely independently brought to life, and here we were. I mean, it was just about to go out on a couple of thousand of 2,500 screens for its opening weekend, and quite something that it got so close to the line with no one really willing to put it in cinemas. No matter though, with that release now sorted, the distributor in place, it could go before critics, and the general response to John Wick was, I'd say, good to very good rather than outright excellent. The style of the film certainly earned its plaudits. Keanu Reeves' central performance earned its plaudits, and many were noting that, well, this opens the door for another franchise that Keanu Reeves could sit at the heart of. There was some pushback on it, but also a general appreciation that the stunt work in the movie was quite something, and that it worked. It held together, and this $25 million production really had a bit more bite to it than quite a lot of the other action projects that Hollywood was offering at the time. And so the box office wasn't in great shape as John Wick launched on the weekend of October the 23rd to the 25th in the US. That it had been a tricky year for big blockbuster movies, and predictably, given we were in October 2014, it was a horror movie that topped the chart the week John Wick came out. Ouija was opening with 19.8 million for Universal. They quite happy with that. But John Wick sparked $14.4 million worth of business on its opening weekend, which was enough to put it in second place above films like Fury and Gone Girl, The Book of Life, Alexandra and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day, which is a pretty decent family movie if you've had the pleasure. Dracula Untold was around, Robert Downey Jr. headlined The Judge, but a bit of a list of box office underperformers, really. And John Wick didn't, in truth, set things massively alight. It was down to 6th place the following week as Nightcrawler opened. Nightcrawler is an outstanding film. And then the week after that, along came Big Hero 6 and Interstellar. John Wick just clinging in to the top 10. It had fallen out after 4 weeks as Dumb and Dumber 2 topped the chart with a depressing $36 million. And John Wick's American gross was $43 million. It's outside of America, it added another 42 million, and that was pretty comfortable. I mean, no one was expecting it to set the box office absolutely alight. It had done decent business, it had returned a profit, and the door was open for some degree of follow-up. It was the follow-up that came in 2017, costed at $40 million, that really opened the door to the John Wick franchise that we know a bit more about now. This was less lean, and I'm sure I'll come to the sequels at some point, but what had happened is this 2014 film had, of course, sparked a really compelling modern Hollywood action franchise, one that's quite distinct as well. At the point this podcast is being recorded, we're on the eve of the release of John Wick Chapter 4, and that one's running to nearly 3 hours and costing a lot more money. Nobody's talking the exact amount that John Wick 4 is costing, but around $90 to $100 million is the estimated price. And I mean, that's still very lean by Hollywood standards, but also it's 4 or 5 times the amount it cost to make the first one. No matter, this had opened up not just a franchise, but a fresh career strand, really, for the people involved. That Derek Kolstad has penned the follow-ups to John Wick as well, and also the relatively recent, at the time of recording, action movie Nobody, which I'll come to in a future episode. Chad Stahelski has continued directing John Wick sequels as well. He's done the 2nd, 3rd and 4th film, whereas David Leitch splintered off and made Atomic Blonde, directed Deadpool 2, the Fast and Furious spin-off Hobbs and Shaw is on his CV as well, and the more recent Brad Pitt headlined film Bullet Train. And as for John Wick himself, well, people know his name now, not just the star of 4 films and counting, with the possibility of a 5th on the way, not just a film that utterly reignited Keanu Reeves' career, but also is now spawning spin-offs of its own. At the point this has been recorded, the film Ballerina, a spin-off of the John Wick series, is currently in production, heading into post-production, and there's also continued talk of a television spin-off as well, called The Continental. That's currently earmarked to debut towards the end of 2023, having been shot filming began on it towards the back end of 2021. Not bad, really, for a film written on spec called Scorn that had 3 offers, didn't have a distributor at the point where they were a month and a half away from release, and came to a star at a point in his career where the hunt for a brand new action franchise wasn't really top of his agenda. But look how things have turned out. Not bad, really. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. I'm just going to do my parish notices at this point. So, first thing, if you like this podcast, there are 3 ways you can support it. I'm grateful for any all of these, if you're happy to do them. First of all, if you're happy to put some coins in the pot and head to patreon.com/Simon Brew, the financial support we get there pays for the research materials, also pays for me to bring new writers through and give them a break for our website as well. In return, you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You get it ad-free. You find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes as well. You get bits of audio that other people don't do. That's patreon.com/Simon Brew. Costing you absolutely nothing is subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice. Things like that really help independent podcasts such as this one, as does leaving a review, ideally a hugely positive review. Thank you so much for all the people who've done that. The word of mouth I get on this podcast has been absolutely invaluable, and I'm hugely appreciative for it. We also have print magazines, Film Stories print magazines. You can find those at store.filmstories.co.uk. A new one of those has just gone on sale. And I have live shows coming up. So at the point this has been recorded, on the 29th of March 2023, I am, a week and a bit away, I'm in Birmingham at the Midlands Arts Centre. Then on the 20th of April 2023, I'm in London, back at King's Place. And then on the 3rd of May 2023, I'm in the northwest of England in Stockport at the brilliant Light up there. Tickets for these Movie Geek live shows, where I waffle on about films an awful lot, are all on sale. You can find more details at filmstories.co.uk. Just tap on the live events tab at the top of the screen. But that is enough of my parish notices. I'm going to crack on with the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode. I absolutely love this movie as well. Let me play you a clip just to get you in the mood. I'll come to the story of it the other side of this.
I used to daydream about being old enough to go on dates. I had this image of myself holding hands with a really cute guy. Just having some sort of freedom, I guess.
Jay, I'm sorry.
Help.
You're not gonna believe me, and I need you to remember what I'm saying. This thing, it's gonna follow you. Somebody gave it to me, and I passed it to you. Wherever you are, it's somewhere, walking straight for you. All you can do is pass it along to someone else.
And that is a clip from 2014's It Follows. This film, directed by David Robert Mitchell, who also penned the script, and starring Micah Monroe, Keir Gilchrist, Olivia Liccardi, Lily Seppi, Daniel Savato, and Jake Weary. This is a film, I think, I mean, if you know it, you're likely to love it, but I think more of you will be a little less aware of, and perhaps even less aware of David Robert Mitchell's debut feature, a 2010 coming-of-age independent film called The Myth of the American Sleepover. Now, this didn't do great, it didn't cause great ripples at the box office or anything like that, but it was enough to get him to make his next film, and he had a couple of ideas for what that would be. And so Mitchell would tell Digital Spy in an interview, for instance, that the idea for what would become It Follows originally came to him courtesy of a recurring nightmare that he was having when he was young. And it's the central idea that at some point, someone is always following you, wherever you are in the world. They're going very slowly, but they're always coming for you. And this, I believe, caused him a few sleepless nights. Now, as he got older and continued mulling over this idea, he wove in a separate strand to the film of something being passed on from person to person. Now, people over time have taken that as a metaphor for sexually transmitted diseases as something that underpins It Follows. And David Robert Mitchell would concede that when he was writing it, that was something that he was very aware of as well. But the bottom line really was he had these two separate ideas that he wove into one story that he put together in early 2011. He had a couple of rules of how he wanted to approach it. I mean, he's a happy consumer of horror movies, but he didn't need this to be an origin story. He didn't need to explain the whatever the it is that's following people. I'm going as spoiler light as I possibly can here. And so he was happy to jump straight in as action is already underway and things are already moving. He was also looking kind of to sidestep cliches wherever he could. I mean, he explained this in an interview with Vulture about even the way that the younger characters in the film eventually do battle with the force they find themselves up against. He wanted to do that in a slightly different way. He didn't want a bunch of people who come up with the perfect plan to fight something and defeat something. He wanted a little bit more rawness to that, a little bit less perfection to it. Now, even though he had all these thoughts in his head and he knew roughly which direction that he wanted this particular project to go, it wasn't actually his intent for It Follows to be his second film. In fact, as David Robert Mitchell would tell the AV Club, the plan here was that it would be his third, that he had a second project that he was already developing at this stage that he was intending to go with next. But the problem he had there was he was struggling to get the backing for it. And so he was faced with a conundrum. You can continue to try and fight to do the second film you got planned and basically hope that you can get the funding together. Or there was the more immediate chance to press ahead with the third film, the more horror-tinged one, where the funding was easier to raise and the chances are he would be up and running with that particular project that bit quicker. And so as such, he decided to change the priority of the films that he was looking to make, and the movie that will become It Follows suddenly found itself up to being his second film rather than as originally his third. The financing coming together via independent sources, as is the case with many films of this ilk. It's a couple of different production companies chucked in what turned out to be the relatively modest budget for the film. Northern Lights Films, Animal Kingdom, and Two Flints were the production companies that came together for it. The actual budget in the end was pegged at around $1.3 million. This was really micro-budget horror, but There was in Hollywood, then as there is now, the feeling that micro-budget horror was a pretty good way to make yourself a bit of a return on a film, no matter how the film really turns out. So David Robert Mitchell found himself then casting for his film. He got the script together, and so the casting came together in a fairly traditional way. They auditioned lots of people. They picked the people that they like. So, for instance, Micah Monroe, and this was her breakthrough role really, takes on the lead role in the film, and she just came in to audition. And the story goes that it was one of their auditions where the filmmaking team felt pretty instantly they'd found the person that they wanted, that she was the right person for the part. She was offered the role. She took the role. There you go. Nice and straightforward. If only they could all be that straightforward. It wasn't that much more taxing either to land another crucial component of It Follows' ultimate success, the score from Disaster Piece, otherwise known as Rich Freeland. And so Mitchell liked his video games, had played the game Fez, which Disaster Piece had put together the music for. And so he basically wrote to Rich Freeland. He sent him a copy of the script, said, I'm doing this horror film. I'd like you to do the music for it. Freeland took a look and agreed. And as it turned out, the score to It Follows apparently took just 3 weeks for Disaster Piece to come to bring together. And a quite extraordinary piece of work it is as well. It was the end of September 2013 that filming would begin on It Follows. Given the budget, it's a relatively brief shoot, and it was set in Michigan, which would be the home for the relatively short production of the movie. Now, Mitchell would talk about one of the reasons he chose Michigan was primarily because it was his hometown. He knew people there. It was close to home. Presumably, he was able to get home at night as well. Now, the production company would also chip in that one of the reasons you shoot in Michigan is there are some tax advantages to doing so as well. And when you don't have many dollars to play with, well, you have to be a little bit savvy about it and follow where you can get the breaks. Already, in fact, Mitchell had to pare down his script a little bit just to fit the budget that they had available to shoot the movie. That he'd written it knowing how he was going to shoot the film, but he had to knock back a few of the ideas he put in the original draft of the script. So, for instance, he explained at one point that he got an outdoor concert sequence as one key moment that was in the original draft of the film, but the logistics of doing that on a virtually non-existent budget, of wrestling a bunch of extras, having an outdoor location over which you don't have full control, well, it was just mind-boggling, and they decided the most sensible thing to do here was to drop said outdoor concert sequence from the final cut of the film. In fact, it would never be shot. It was out of the script by the time production began. Now, Mitchell would draw on some of those nightmares that he'd had when he was young, when it came to being on set and shooting the film. What he wasn't looking to do was replicate the specific imagery of the nightmares that he'd been having, but he wanted to capture the feeling that they'd given him. Now, he also confessed that he'd long been watching horror films. He'd watched plenty of horror films underage, and so a whole bunch of touch points were in. I mean, the film Cat People, for instance, is one particular touch point for the film. George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead would be an influence. The work of John Carpenter in there as well. And so he was little hat tips and just capturing the tone of those films and those filmmakers, well, they were wrapped in as well. But even with that bedrock and even with those influences underneath, Mitchell knew too what he wanted to make distinct about his own film. And as he would explain in an interview with Yahoo, he was looking to make it as immersive as possible. That what he wanted to do was put the audience inside the world of the film. And so he was looking to slow down the pacing of it, for instance. He was minimising the cuts that he was going to use as part of the shot. He was going to hold shots a little longer than people would expect, that people would find entirely comfortable. He was going to use little tricks that he could do just to throw people who were watching off kilter. So, for instance, they used wide-angle lenses to add more depth of field to the shots, and also as a result of that, it brought more emphasis to what was going on in the background. Likewise, he would spin the camera again just to throw us off kilter, and with great big huge wide shots and the camera slowly rotating round, he was inviting the audience, and what he was looking to do was invite the audience just to pay attention to what was going on behind the main action, to keep an eye out for someone who would suddenly start walking towards the frame. And in fact, when it came to working with extras on the film as well, every now and then a person would just be instructed instructed to slowly walk into view towards the main characters, but would do it in such a way that it would take a long time to get there and just raise the anxiety levels. What Mitchell was trying to do was just have us watch the film and think, well, it could be any of those people who suddenly starts walking towards the protagonists of the film and putting them into some degree of peril. Really, really effective as well. But also in conjunction with production designer Michael Perry and costume designer Kimberly Letts, they worked out a way to, again, just make us a little bit more unsettled again by not defining exactly when the film is set. So you won't see a mobile phone in the shot, but you will see some other modern trappings that you find within the film. The fashion isn't particularly distinct to a particular era. There's a piece of technology in there called the e-reader, which is basically in a shell. And as Mitchell would explain to the AV Club, there are production design elements from the 50s on up to the modern day. Now, he admitted that a lot of it is from the 70s and 80s, but the e-reader cell phone, or shell phone as they're calling it, wasn't a real device. What it was a 1960s Shell Compact that they turned into a cell phone e-reader. And as Mitchell said, I wanted modern things, but if you show a specific smartphone now, it dates it. So the technology they did deploy for the characters to use in the film, they invented for it, and there's no absolute modern day equivalent of it. Then something a little more traditional and not unusual to horror is Mitchell was playing with his colour coding as well. And again, going particularly spoiler light, anything red in the film is very carefully controlled and is used there for a reason. Likewise, the use of water in the film is very, very particular and is chosen very, very carefully. And because this was a low-budget film over which he had the necessary control, it allowed him to shape the clues and the signposts to what the it that was following is in the frame and in the film as well, and to have the requisite amount of control to be able to realise that. Filming, though, was quick, and it would wrap up in October 2013. They'd had just a month of photography to get this. Even that's quite an achievement given the budget they were working to. But the level of the budget also meant that David Robert Mitchell had creative control over the film and also over the final cut of the film, that he was able to fashion the movie that he wanted to make. That the only real changes that I can find that perhaps he wasn't pushing for himself came in the eventual trailer that was released. That there are shots in the film that do not require or do not utilise a great number of clothes, let me put it as politely as that. But when it came to the trailer, clothing was required, and so there was a little bit of work done to reshoot there and to put clothes where required. It's worth noting there are some, again, I don't want to go into the great detail of it because it might potentially spoil the film, but there is a particularly stark sequence of someone not necessarily robed on top of a building that was done for real, that was also required a degree of stunt performer as well. But again, watch the film, go in unsullied and be suitably surprised, but know when you get to that moment, yep, that actually happened. The film was, Mitchell locked his cut relatively quickly, and unusually for a horror film, it debuted at the Cannes Film Festival in May 2014. Now, this was the first time that Mitchell had been able to see the film with a proper audience, and he would concede to the AV Club this was also the first time when he'd be able really to work out whether or not It Follows was working for an audience as well. Certainly the critics were quick to champion it, and this would actually be fairly crucial to what happened next for It Follows. That a little bit of pushback perhaps on the ending of it, but a really, really positive swathe of responses to that Cannes debut came through, not least because here was a horror film that actually managed to get under lots of people's skins. Now, full disclosure, I've watched a lot of horror cinema. In the last 20 years, It Follows is the film that's got under my skin the most. I sat and watched it in a very, very quiet room, almost ripping the armrests off the chair at certain stages. The sheer patience of it, the holding of the shots, and a final cut that just doesn't gallop its way through is all very much to the film's credit. And so there was a growing word of mouth about the film, even though it was still a long, long way away from release. That it was picked up for distribution around the world. So in America, for instance, Radius TWC was the distributor that acquired the film. Now, this was a label as part of the Weinstein Company, headed up by convicted rapist Harvey Weinstein. And the collapse of the Weinstein Empire also took down Radius TWC in the end. That hadn't quite happened at the point that It Follows was being released. And in fact, in the UK, the rights would be picked up by Icon Film Distribution instead. And in fact, in the end, Icon would release the film in the UK ahead of the release of the movie in the US. It got its first major territory release in France on February the 4th, 2015. So we're about 7-8 months on from the Cannes Film Festival at this point. And then in the UK, it hit on February the 27th, 2015. The US release date was originally pegged for March the 13th, with the idea of originally just putting it out as in a couple of cinemas ahead of a video on demand release. This was not an unusual tactic, particularly for horror films, that you put it in a few cinemas for a week and then you hope that the word of mouth you get from some degree of publicity around that cinema release will fuel people's curiosity, so they'll go and buy it on a video on demand service. However, the film had done well in the UK and the excellent reviews had followed it to UK critics as well. And so Radius TWC decided it was going to take a bit of a chance, that it would broaden the planned release of It Follows from just a handful of screens up to 1,200. All this for a $1.3 million horror movie. It didn't take long for this decision to pay off. That, as Variety would report very quickly, It Follows is on pace to be the top grossing film in Radius TWC's history after the low-budget horror film pulled in $4 million in its first weekend of wide release. Now, that wide release followed a week or two after the 13th of March debut. So when it did land in the US on that opening weekend of the 13th to the 15th, It Follows was only at that stage on 4 screens, but its screen average of $40,000 was comfortably the highest in the chart. The number one film that week was Cinderella, the live-action take from Disney, which grossed $67 million in its opening weekend, but its screen average was $17,000. There was word of mouth building for It Follows, and its second week, it was up to 19th place in the chart, even though it was playing only on 32 screens. So that expansion to 1,200 came the week after, and It Follows stormed into the top 5. Remarkable achievement. Playing on 1,218 screens in total, its gross that weekend was $3.8 million. Now, the chart was topped by the animation Home, followed by Get Hard. They grossed 52 and 33 million respectively. But It Follows had just edged out other films that were around at the time. The Gunman was about, that starred Sean Penn in the lead role, and that was hanging around in 10th place after 2 weeks and dropping. Liam Neeson-headlined Run All Night was in there at 8th place. The Divergent series Insurgent was in 3rd. And the key thing really was that It Follows was holding its own against some pretty stiff competition in the chart, to the point where the Radius TWC upped the screen count even further the following week, putting it on another 400 screens in total, and it brought in another couple of million at the box office, even as Fast and Furious 7 came along and ate up all the money in the world. By the time It Follows left US cinemas, it had grossed $14.6 million. Again, a remarkable achievement, really, given the foundations of the film. Throw in the money that it made outside of America as well, and the total box office return just in cinemas was just shy of $22 million before It Follows earned a comfortable living too when it arrived on home format. And this was just regarded as a success, as top 10 lists came around at the end of the year, even though it wasn't troubling the Oscars or anything like that. It Follows found itself in quite a lot of critics' top 10 lists. And so there were question marks at one point. It's like, is there a sequel in this? I mean, this is horror cinema. If you've got a low budget film that's broken through and made money, surely you want to make another one, don't you? Well, Mitchell didn't really, and he fielded a question or two about whether he was planning a sequel as he was doing the promotional tour, particularly for the US release. But he argued that it's tricky because I've only made these 2 films, but I have a million different scripts and a million different things that I want to make. And he argued too that the 2 films he'd made to that point had happened to be about teenagers, but he'd got stories about many different characters at many different stages of life. And so he was more inclined to pursue those. That didn't stop the Radius TWC executives from suggesting that a sequel was a possibility, but the decline of that company probably took away any chance of that happening, certainly coming driven by the company rather than Mitchell himself. And Mitchell, of course, had that creative control on It Follows, which had been crucial. And so he was inclined, even though that there were conversations of him doing much bigger budget fare, he was inclined to do 1 or 2 smaller movies first to find his feet, and also over which he would continue to enjoy that level of control. He would go on to make, therefore, the hugely divisive Under the Silver Lake with Andrew Garfield, which was made for a modest sum, and it'd be fair to say that one split the audience a lot more than It Follows did. More recently, in 2020, MGM snapped up a project from him, Heroes and Villains, a superhero project that he'd written and directed, although at the point this podcast has been recorded in March of 2023, there's no sign yet of that moving forward. But what has been left behind It Follows isn't just an excellent film that we're still talking about nearly a decade later, but a whole load of analysis as to it. And Mitchell was keen never really to provide actual answers. He wasn't trying to spell out what the film was, what it was about, and there's quite a lot of it that's left open to interpretation, and there's a whole bunch of stuff online, if you want to read, of people trying to interpret it. For me, I think It Follows is an absolute standout piece of horror. Just talking about it for 20 minutes to you has just brought the goosebumps back, and has just got that feeling that someone out there is coming towards me to take me down. Hopefully that won't happen, because I'm planning the next episode of this, and I'm hoping to be back next week. For now, though, I'm just going to round this particular episode off, and thank you for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. That's on Twitter as well. If you go to Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories. The Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew, and our website is filmstories.co.uk. It's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features and such like. You can find our shop at store.filmstories.co.uk, where you can buy loads of our magazines, as many as you want. You buy more, love you. Or our Sneakers Blu-ray. We might have more Blu-ray news coming for you in due course, but I can't say too much about that, short of the fact that we might have signed a piece of paper this week, but that's all I'm going to add just for the minute. In the meantime, I'm going to wish you well. I'm going to thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your support. I'm going to be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all look after yourselves. Take care, and bye-bye.